How can human rights be respected in the time of coronavirus? Many countries are accused of using the fight against the pandemic as an excuse to crack down on people's freedoms. But how difficult is it to balance that fight and basic rights? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle, Carey. The coronavirus restrictions are meant to save lives, but for authoritarian leaders, they can be an excuse to adopt repressive measures. And the COVID-19 emergency is fast becoming a human rights crisis. That's the warning from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He's highlighted a rise in hate speech, the targeting of vulnerable groups, and heavy-handed security responses. He's also said there's discrimination in the way public services are being delivered to tackle the pandemic. The UN says aggressive cyber policies are increasingly being used. Journalists, health workers, and activists are being targeted. Guterres didn't specifically name countries violating human rights. Here's what he had to say in his video message.
The rising ethno-nationalism, populism, authoritarianism, and the pushback against human rights in some countries, the crisis can provide a pretext to adopt repressive measures for purposes unrelated to the pandemic. This is unacceptable. More than ever, governments must be transparent, responsive, and accountable. Civic space and press freedom are critical. Civil society organizations and the private sector have essential roles to play. We must ensure that any emergency measures, including states of emergency, are legal, proportionate, necessary, and non-discriminatory, have a specific focus and duration, and take the least intrusive approach possible to protect public health.
The UN says it's received reports of rights being abused in several countries. South African security officers are accused of using disproportionate force to impose restrictions, particularly in informal settlements. And police are investigating officers over allegations of murder, rape, and corruption. In the Philippines, 120,000 people were arrested for violating a curfew. The UN describes the country's response as highly militarized. Online surveillance, intimidation, and detention of doctors and journalists have been reported in China. The U.S. and some European countries are allegedly refusing to provide shelter to migrants to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Let's bring in our guests now. In Bangkok, we have Anna-Karin Jatfors. She's the Deputy Regional Director at United Nations Women. In Amman, we have journalist Daoud Khattab and Frederick Rowski, also in Bangkok. He is the director for the Asia and Pacific program at the International Commission of Jurists. Welcome to all of you. So the Secretary General, he did not want to name countries, but we are naming countries because we have to have this discussion. And I want to start in China specifically. So the doctor that basically tried to blow the whistle about how severe this virus at the time, not necessarily a pandemic, was, ended up getting a visit from police and ended up dying later. Frederick, I'm going to start with you. How would you characterize the actions of China during the spread of this virus and in the aftermath?
Well, look, I think as we look across the region, including China, we see the governments that are normally inclined to take authoritarian or militarized approaches to things, taking them in this case. And it's not a great surprise that China tried to suppress information about the virus in the early days, nor is it a surprise that they took action against that doctor and others at that early stage. This is a weakness in the way we operate in this part of the world, and it's a weakness in the authoritarian impulse to suppress bad information. It's that kind of lack of transparency that can be dangerous. I mean, fortunately, it's unfortunately in a case like this, a virus of this scale, you simply can't suppress that information. It's going to spread. The information is going to spread. The virus is going to spread. And I hope that a lesson has been learned here. And we are seeing more transparency and more communication and more sharing of information across the region now. But it was a terrible start. It was a terrible beginning to the first government response to this.
And yes, you're right. This is obviously, it tends to be an attempt to control the message, to control any bad information about a particular country. But in the long run, it often ends up backfiring, does it not? Why do governments and regimes continue to behave this way when it comes to something like this, Frederick?
Yes, well, look, this is our message over and over again, which is at a time like this, the most important thing is that government institutions have credibility, that people trust them, that the public trusts law enforcement, they trust policymakers, they trust public health officials. That kind of response, non-transparency, suppression of speech, overreaching states of emergency, these are all things that are going to diminish public trust and are ultimately going to undermine the legitimate public health goals of the response. So I do think people are learning that in this case a little bit too late. But our message is that starting from the beginning, taking a human rights compliant approach, framing your public policy, your law and policy responses in human rights and within the framework that's provided by international law is ultimately going to improve the outcomes, improve the public health outcomes, improve the public trust in government institutions. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think considering complying with human rights is going to build public trust rather than break it down. And this is a message we keep bringing over and over again.
I want to pick up that point that you made about public trust. Daoud, there has been a lot of it's been difficult sometimes to get people to do what the government asks, supposedly in the name of safety, because people just don't sometimes trust their government. They don't trust the information they're getting. Have you seen governments that are really weaponizing fake news to try to, and because of that, you're trying to get a certain action out of people, but they just don't trust or believe their own leaders?
Well, yes, I think in the Middle East we've had a few different kind of reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic. In Egypt, there was an attempt to keep a lid on the information, and eventually information came out, and the government reacted in a very brutal way and has kept many of the political journalists and others, human rights activists, in prison. In Jordan, they tried kind of a mix. They tried a strong security clampdown on lockdown on people, but at the same time, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health came across on television in a very pleasant way, in a very gentle and human way, to try to explain to people that this is for their own interest. And I think they did a good job to a certain degree in Jordan. In Palestine, Israel, also you saw different reactions. For example, Netanyahu used the pandemic to clobber a coalition that's quite bad in terms of the annexation and trying to change the High Court of Israel. In the Palestinian areas, we saw the Prime Minister did a good job in controlling, and the discipline was quite high. So different countries had different reactions, but you're right that if people don't trust their government, that's one of the biggest problems you have. And in a pandemic or an emergency, people need to have that anchor. They need to know that they can trust that person who comes on every day, and telling them what to do. In order to follow that lead, they need to trust their government.
Anna-Karin, the effect that this pandemic is having on everyone is not equal. It is, in a lot of cases, it's worse for the poor, it's worse for people of color, and in particular, it has been a horrific time for women. The cases of domestic violence have spiked in countries all around the world. Tell me what you're seeing.
So indeed, as we have seen around the world, as countries are employing these restrictive measures, lockdowns, quarantines, and so on, of course, it means that for millions of women, they end up locked up and locked in together with their abuser. We know that 1/3 of women will experience violence at some point in her life, and largely by an intimate partner. And so, of course, when there's strain on families, there's reduced access to mobility, reduced access to services, then we have a horrific situation whereby women are more exposed to violence, but at the same time have less access to the very people who would normally help them, their friends, their neighbors, their family members, police, health services. So this is really a critical challenge to make sure that in this response, as health systems are so thinly stretched and in many cases diverting their attention away from these critical regular services that victims and survivors of violence need, that they do not do it to the extent that these services are not available, because we know that they are life-saving, they make a huge difference, and they must be available as part of the response.
So what of that? I mean, obviously there are groups within the anti-domestic violence, the social justice movement, that are trying to be responsive, that are doing what they can to help. But what role should governments be playing in this? I mean, there are many governments that are passing stimulus packages with money for this, money for that. Are you saying that that should be part of those types of packages?
Absolutely. And of course, we haven't yet talked about the economic impact of this, where we know also women are more at risk, of course, of losing their jobs, of losing their income. And they must be a part of the economic stimulus to make sure that the packages are actually reaching the most vulnerable women, the migrants, the small entrepreneurs, the women in agriculture, the domestic workers. These are the ones who, of course, are so overrepresented in these sectors that are now being the most affected. And so having them really benefiting and tapping into these stimulus packages is absolutely critical. But governments can do more than that. They can continue, of course, to invest in these services. And we are working with governments around the world to find virtual ways to provide that support. We know the critical role of hotlines. We know that there's a need to maintain and find safe housing in safe ways. We know that where women are placed in quarantine centers, for example, they need to be separated from potential abusers so that they are not further victimized. So these are all areas where we are working with governments around the region to make sure that in the response, we are not inadvertently putting women at increased risk, and that we're actually taking the opportunity now as we shift into the recovery to actually tackle these deeply rooted gender inequalities, which, of course, as we know, did not arise by this pandemic. They existed in all of the societies in our region and beyond beforehand, but of course are magnified in this very challenging context that we are all in at the moment.
And Frederick, Anna-Karin mentioned migrants. Migrants and refugees obviously were already just in a very bad way for years now in various camps around the world. What is happening in some of these communities? How much more at risk are they? And as these governments have these, repressive measures, what effect does it have on them?
Yeah, well, those communities are particularly vulnerable for a whole bunch of different reasons. They are subject to discrimination, xenophobia. We can see some terrible things coming into public view in Malaysia, anti-Muslim language coming from government officials in India. We have internal migrant workers, and migrant workers that are trying to return to their countries are especially vulnerable right now. In India, you've got 400 million informal sector workers, many of whom simply can't abide by strict lockdown rules for various reasons. Some lack shelter, many lack access to food. In many countries, they also fall outside of much of the social safety net that exists. They don't have access to public services and government services in the best of times. And right now, that's even less likely. So there are also intersections with conflict, right? So you've got refugee communities, the Rohingya community in Bangladesh, enormous vulnerabilities there. And you already see people fleeing from Myanmar trying to reach other parts of the region that are now shut down. So I think there's also, there are short-term and long-term issues here as well. We're trying to deal with the immediate emergencies that these communities are facing. But there's also a real danger that we see impacts on longer-term policy. We were already in a state of the world where immigration policy was becoming more restricted, more draconian. We need to make sure that the outcomes of this period of history are that we realize that those policies are going to create more problems than they're going to solve. And we don't end up in a situation where some of these prejudices and some of the actions that are being taken by governments now harden into, even worse kind of prejudicial, discriminatory, anti-immigrant, anti-migrant policies.
Okay, so you talk about anti-immigrant. That's actually where I was going next. Let me ask you about that. I mean, it would seem that when we talk about countries that are going overboard, perhaps when it comes to oppressive measures, and you would be thinking dictatorships. But obviously, what's at risk are a lot of democracies here that seem to be really pushing boundaries. The U.S. in particular President Donald Trump has now an immigration ban in place that may or may not really be effective when it comes to containing this. There's obviously already, hundreds of thousands of cases in the U.S. What concern do you have about some of these immigration bans?
Well, look, the problem is that what COVID has done is it's exacerbated existing issues. And it's shined a light on policies that are corrosive and destructive from the beginning. I mean, the truth is that we have a set of principles that we can use to shape sensible policy. I mean, a across-the-board ban on immigration, particularly if it's aimed at particular religious or ethnic groups, is absolutely unacceptable. But you can carve a reasonable policy out of basic rule of law principles that the restrictions are prescribed by law, they're necessary, they're proportionate, they're non-discriminatory, they're based on evidence. And in a context like this, countries are shutting down, but borders are shutting down. But this has to be done in a way that is that abides by those basic rule of law principles, and particularly aren't discriminatory based on ethnicity, religion. Yeah,
let me bring Daoud into this. So do you have any concerns about some of these immigration bans that we're seeing under the guise of, protecting citizens?
Well, I want to talk also about the women issue, because in Jordan and other countries, a kind of indirect result of the lockdown is that courts were closed down. Most lawyers were not able to go to their offices. And as you said, the numbers of domestic violence cases are on the rise, yet there's really no remedies. But on the immigrant issue there in Jordan, for example, we have two kinds of problems. One is the migrant laborers. We have almost 700,000 Egyptian laborers. Many of them do day labor. I mean, they get paid for the day that they work. And for like 40 days, they haven't worked and there's no income. And they can't go back to Egypt, and so they're stuck, and out of no fault of their own. So that's one problem. The Syrian refugees, on the other hand, seem to be taken care of by the United Nations. The camps and the others are quite resilient. Yep, it seems to the COVID-19. We haven't heard a single case. I don't know how much testing there has been, but it seems that it hasn't spread so well, and that, thank God. In the refugee camps, although there's about 1.2 million Syrian refugees in Jordan, so far we haven't heard of any cases of infection, so that's kind of good news. But there is worry that the migrants and the immigrants could be vulnerable communities in the future.
Anna-Karin, I mean, by virtue of the fact that a pandemic is happening, there do need to be different rules, whether they're temporary or whatever, to try to get a handle on things. I mean, that's just life. But how do you get that balance right to get people to do what is safe for them without being oppressive? I mean, that is a difficult balance for leaders that are trying to do it right, at least.
That's right. And I think with that, there are a few things that can help governments to really strike the balance. The first, and I think this is very critical, is having access to solid data and information. Who is affected? How are they affected? Disaggregated by sex, by age, by migrant status, by disability, whatever it might be. And then you know where you need to target your efforts.
So let me stop you.
The second one I would say is
one thing. So I think that's a great point. So basically, you're saying there doesn't necessarily need to be a heavy-handed measure for your entire country if you actually have a handle on what and who it is you're dealing with.
What I meant was that if we know who is affected, then we know how we can provide that support in the recovery phase. So, for example, if we know that women are more likely to lose their jobs, then we know that the financial stimulus would need to provide and target those women, for example. I think people understand that there are restrictions of movement, that there are public health measures that governments need to take. But the key thing, as Fredrik mentioned, is that we do it in a non-discriminatory way, and that we make sure that we have services that are available to everyone without discrimination. that we have testing that is available to everyone without discrimination, that where we have women, for example, who are facing victims of violence, that they're able to get the support that they need, that no one escaping violence is targeted for breaking a lockdown order, for example. And of course, particularly when it comes to migrants, as Frederick mentioned, we know that women migrants are probably the most marginalized of them all, because they are predominantly in the informal sector, where they may not have labor rights, they may not have access to pensions and support, where they are often living in the homes of the employer, where either their employer leaves, they're in legal limbo, or they might not be able to move around, which can further expose their risk of violence. So really having the data of who is affected to know how we can support them is essential. And of course, having clear information and non-discriminatory approaches based on human rights.
Frederick, how concerned are you that some governments, particularly what's happening with Viktor Orban in Hungary, that some governments, some leaders are just going to grab power and never let go, even when this is over?
Right. I mean, we've seen this happen on the war on terror. We've seen this happen in other contexts, and we have a lot of concern that we're going to see similar things here. Look at Hong Kong at the moment. We're having arrests of pro-democracy activists for participating in protests from a year ago. These are happening at a time when it's quite easy for the government to intervene without concern about protests. We have a state of emergency in the Philippines, which you mentioned earlier, is quite militarized. We have some concerns in Thailand. They have a bad history of overreaching in states of emergency. We have Cambodia, which is particularly absurd because a state of emergency was called there. There's hardly any more power to grab for that government. But there are also ways, as I mentioned before, to take these actions in a sensible and law-abiding way. New Zealand appears to be doing a pretty good job.
It seems Germany as well, too.
Germany as well. And, New Zealand, these are places that aren't accustomed to using these tools. They've used them judiciously and proportionately, although it's pretty extreme. I mean, they're also putting enormous limitations on freedom of movement, other freedoms. And at the same time, I have to say, our concern is about this overreach and the threats to the rule of law, which are very real. I think it's been proven so far that you don't need an authoritarian state to do this effectively. There are plenty of democratic governments that are imposing restrictions. The population I find it extraordinary how people are abiding by social distancing and other measures under very difficult circumstances. And I think the human species has showed an enormous amount of collective power and restraint at this moment. But I do think there's an enormous danger, and especially in this region, that governments are going to try and write some of these emergency measures into law and policy that will extend well beyond this initial period. And the fact that we're likely to be with COVID one way or another for quite some time means that we're going to have to keep an eye on this. There's going to be a struggle for the next year or longer. Yep.
And we will keep an eye on it, and we hope you all will as well, and will join us again to discuss this. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. Thanks to our guests, Anna-Karin Jatfors, Daoud Kataib, and Frederick Browski. And thank you for watching as well. You can see the program again anytime. Go to our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. I'll handle us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team, bye for now.